As we continue our study in the Gospel of John, we are now in chapter 18, verses 38b through 40. In this brief passage, Pilate finds no guilt in the Lord Jesus, and Pilate reminds the Jews of the custom of releasing a prisoner. They choose Barabbas, not Jesus. Chapter 18, verse 38, the second part. And saying this, again, he went out to the Jews, and he says to them, I myself find no guilt in him. The translation, I myself, is an attempt to show that because the word ego is used, the word I has emphasis. The word translated guilt here is aitia. It can simply mean cause, but in a legal context, a courtroom scene like this, it sure seems to have the meaning of guilt, or as BDAG explains, a basis for legal action, or a charge, or a ground of complaint, a ground for complaint. Pilate is in a difficult position, difficult and dangerous for him. He doesn't want to take up the challenge of hearing about truth from Jesus. Remember, in the first half of verse 38, Pilate had just said, what is truth? Probably in a scornful attitude, possibly in a wistful attitude, but most likely in scorn. He doesn't want to talk about truth from the Lord Jesus, who we remember is the way, the truth, and the life. So he walks away. But the only direction he can walk is towards the Jewish leaders and the Jewish mob. And he hates them. He doesn't want to talk to the man that, at least on the surface, seems to be a troublesome rabbi, but he sure doesn't want to support the Jewish leaders that he despises. He will find that there is no middle ground. There is no compromise in questions about the Lord Jesus and who he is. And be sure to understand that Pilate was a real historical governor, and these events really actually happened. This is history. But also in the Gospel of John, Pilate would represent those that want to stay neutral about the gospel and the identity of Jesus, but they're forced to be enemies of Jesus because they refuse to come to him. So Pilate is a real historical figure, but he also represents everybody like him. In the Gospel of John, John does seem to like to bring up people that represent a whole crowd, a whole group, a whole kind of people. Chapter 18, verse 39. Now it's a custom among you that I release someone to you on the Passover. So do you desire that I release to you the King of the Jews? Now, a just and truth-loving governor that's just said, I find no guilt in him, would then he'd release the prisoner and deal with the crowd, however the crowd had to be dealt with. But Pilate was not a lover of truth and justice. We don't know exactly why Pilate brings up this custom. Perhaps he just couldn't resist the idea of poking a bit more fun at them, the King of the Jews. He couldn't resist insulting them one more time with the fact that he had their king as his prisoner. If that was his motivation, he will later regret the insult. Now, outside the Gospels, there is no clear record of this custom of releasing a prisoner to the Jews on the Passover. Some commentators bring up a certain passage in the Mishnah, that collection of rabbinic tradition. The specific passage is called Pesachim 8:6, but Peshaim 8:6 is very unclear what it means in itself, and its connection to this custom of releasing a prisoner on the Passover is far from certain. Chapter 18, verse 40. So they all shouted back, we see the word palin here, so they all shouted back, saying, "Not this one, but Barabbas." Now, Barabbas was a thief, and that word thief is lestes. The word translated back, shouted back, back here is palin. It's often translated again, but that translation doesn't fit very well here. Perhaps there was an unrecorded shouting that happened earlier, but it would be very odd to say again, but not tell your readers about the first instance, the first shouting. No, there's a better solution. And again, we turn to BDAG, the Standard Greek Lexicon. And in BDAG, it notes that the word palin can also mean on the other hand or in turn. And the commentator Michaels agrees that that's the appropriate understanding here. So probably no previous unrecorded shouting. So this is shouting again. No, they shouted back. They shouted in turn. And we've already seen the Greek word palin with that meaning in John 12:22. Philip goes and tells Andrew, and in turn, palin, Andrew and Philip tell Jesus. So the translation shouted back is appropriate, and it doesn't need to be translated shouted again. The word translated thief here is lestes, and it can mean thief, but it can also mean robber or rebel or insurrectionist. And according to Luke 23:19, Barabbas was imprisoned, that passage says, on account of a rebellion in the city and for murder. Matthew 27:26 and Mark 15:15 tell us that indeed Barabbas was freed. John doesn't actually mention that. Oh, here's Matthew 27:26. Then he released Barabbas to them, but he had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. Mark 15:15, wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. Well, Matthew and Mark do mention that Barabbas was, in fact, freed. John doesn't happen to mention that. It's not a contradiction. It's just what John decided to include and what he didn't include. The name Barabbas. Well, that's just an English pronunciation of the Greek word Barabbas. And that Greek word is just a Greek pronunciation for the Aramaic name Bar Abba. Bar is son, that's Aramaic. Ben would be the corresponding Hebrew word. And Abba, we all know Abba, father. So Barabbas is son of the father or son of a father. That's what that name means. So Tenney says, by a strange irony, the pseudo-son of the father was released, but the real son of the father was crucified. And Bruce mentions another ironic element here, saying the man whose release was granted had been convicted of the same kind of offense as that with which Jesus was now charged. And of course, Jesus was charged with that charge, but he was innocent. So returning to our verse, chapter 18, verse 40, they all shouted back saying, not this one, but Barabbas. Now, Barabbas was a thief. There would be no help from the crowd in releasing the obviously innocent Jesus. They hate him. Pilate seems to want to release this prisoner, Jesus, but the crowd doesn't want to, and the crowd won't help him release the innocent Jesus. Well, Pilate is finding there is no middle ground. Take a stand for Jesus, believe him, or join with the Jews in calling for his crucifixion. Ironically, again, more irony. John, remember, really likes to mention irony. Ironically, here's a man judging Jesus who finds himself being judged. Pilate is judging Jesus, but it really is pointing out how guilty Pilate is. Judgment is a major theme in this gospel. It was first introduced in John's introduction, and it's developed further here. Pilate probably thought he was a skilled manipulator, but it turns out because there is no middle ground, he ends up being the one manipulated by the Jewish leaders and their mob. As we will see later in chapter 19, John is presenting historical data which shows that the Jews were more guilty than Pilate. Let's look at a few of those verses. John 19:4. So Pilate went out again and says to them, "Look, I am bringing him out to you so that you may know that I find no basis for a charge or no guilt in him." John 19:6. So when the high priest and the servants saw him, they shouted out, saying, "Crucify, crucify him." Pilate says to them, You take him and crucify him. I do not find in him any basis for a charge or any guilt. 19:7. The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and according to our law, he ought to die, because he made himself the Son of God." John 19:11, Jesus answered, "You would have no authority at all over me unless it was given to you from above. Therefore," these are the words of Jesus, "therefore, the one who handed me over to you has the greater sin." John 19:12 says the same thing, emphasizes the same thing. For this reason, Pilate was trying to release him, but the Jews were shouting, saying, "If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Everyone making himself a king opposes Caesar." Thus, in this way, chapter 1, verse 11 is again fulfilled. That verse says, "He came to his own, but his own did not receive him." So in this passage, we see the Lord insulted and abused, but we also see him in great glory, the glory that he sought, the glory of perfect obedience to the one who sent him. By way of summary, in this brief passage, Pilate declares he finds no guilt in Jesus, and then Pilate reminds the Jews that they have a custom of releasing a prisoner, and they choose a thief or an insurrectionist, a rebel, not Jesus.